The smell hit him before the light did. It was the scent of a sanitized grave, bleach, ozone, and the cold metallic tang of an industrial refrigerator. Elias Thorne opened his eyes to a ceiling of uniform white tiles. To a master horologist, life was defined by the rhythmic heartbeat of a balance wheel, but here, the only sound was the soul-sucking hum of a fluorescent bulb. He tried to move his fingers, the delicate instruments that had resurrected the rarest Patek Philippe movements in existence, but they were encased in heavy, rigid casts. His hands, his legacy, felt like two lead weights anchored to the sheets. "The patient is awake," a voice droned, distant and hollow. Elias ignored the shadow in the doorway. His gaze was locked on the wall-mounted television, a flickering portal to the world that had buried him alive. On the screen, the glare of camera flashes illuminated a stage in Geneva. There stood Julian, his protégé, a man Elias had treated like a son, a man who possessed half the talent and double the greed. Julian was holding a timepiece aloft, the perpetual chronograph. The mechanism was Elias's magnum opus, a blueprint etched into his very marrow over 20 years of sleepless nights. On the screen, Julian's smile was a row of polished teeth, sharp as a wolf's. "I call this the thornless revolution," Julian told the cheering crowd, his voice dripping with false humility. "A tribute to my late mentor, whose tragic mental decline left this masterpiece unfinished. I merely found the missing pieces." The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Julian Vance unveils the eternal. Elias Thorne declared legally incapacitated." A bitter cold, deeper than any winter wind, settled in Elias's chest. They hadn't just stolen his work, they had erased his personhood. He was a ghost watching his own funeral, seeing the vulture pick the gold from his teeth. The legal documents on the bedside table were a death warrant signed in ink and betrayal. He looked at his bound hands. The world thought he was broken, a spent spring in a discarded case. But beneath the casts, a singular white-hot thought began to tick. It wasn't the rhythmic beat of a clock, but the heavy, deliberate pulse of a reckoning. Julian had the crown, but Elias still had the gears, and he would dismantle that empire piece by agonizing piece. The room was a sensory vacuum, but Elias Thorne's mind was a workshop of polished steel and cold calculation. He stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the perforations to keep his sanity from fraying. He remembered the way Julian Vance had first appeared at his atelier, not as a predator, but as a stray. He had come with damp shoes and a look of practiced reverence, a young man who spoke of horology as if it were a religion. Elias, blinded by the flickering light of his own ego, had opened the heavy oak doors. He had let the viper coil around his hearth. It hadn't been a sudden heist, it was a legal dismantling, a slow-motion demolition performed with the precision of a surgeon. Julian had handled the paperwork Elias loathed, the insurance riders, the NDA extensions, the power of attorney for the sake of the legacy.
Every document Elias signed was another screw tightened in his own coffin. Julian had groomed the board of directors, whispering about Elias's erratic focus and trembling hands while pouring the old man's scotch.
The betrayal tasted like copper and old dust. But as Elias lay in the sterile silence, he stopped mourning his hands and started auditing his masterpiece, the Eternal. Julian believed he held the pinnacle of watchmaking, a movement that defied the friction of time itself. But Julian was a curator, not a creator. He understood the how, but he lacked the soul to understand the why. Elias closed his eyes, visualizing the intricate blueprints etched into his memory. He navigated the gears, past the tourbillon, into the very heart of the alloy. Years ago, a paranoid instinct, the same one that makes a man bury gold in a cellar, had led him to make a silent adjustment. He had introduced a microscopic instability into the balance springs housing, a proprietary blend of palladium and copper. It was a thermal ghost. Under the intense, consistent heat of a collector's wrist or the high-output display lights of a Geneva showroom, the alloy would subtly expand at a disproportionate rate. It wouldn't break the watch today or tomorrow, but the friction would begin a slow, rhythmic self-destruction, a mechanical cancer eating the movement from the inside out.
Julian hadn't stolen a masterpiece. He had walked away with a ticking time bomb. "You took the crown, boy," Elias whispered, his voice a dry rasp against the hospital sheets. "But you don't know the physics of the fall." The architect was in a cage, but he knew exactly where the structural flaw was hidden. He just had to wait for the heat to rise. The walls of the St. Jude's psychiatric wing didn't just hold Elias, they breathed with the heavy, humid stagnation of a swamp. The air tasted of industrial bleach and the metallic tang of unwashed copper. To the world, Elias Thorne was a spent spring, a mind wound too tight until it snapped. To the board of directors, he was a line item, a lucrative corpse they could milk for insurance premiums. But the board had a leak. Every machine has a point of friction, and Elias knew exactly where the grease turned to grit.
Dr. Elias Thorne, no relation, though the irony was a jagged pill, was the facility's chief administrator. He was a man of expensive tastes and a shallow pocketbook, currently drowning in gambling debts to a syndicate in Macau. Elias watched him through the small reinforced window of his cell. He watched the way the doctor's hands shook when he checked his watch, a mass-produced quartz piece that ticked with the soulless rhythm of a metronome. Elias waited for his window. It came in the form of Marcus Sterling, a high-priced estate attorney who looked like he'd been carved out of cold marble. 10 years ago, Elias had saved the Sterling family's 1890 Patek Philippe minute repeater from a house fire, rebuilding the scorched complications by hand. Marcus didn't owe him a fee, he owed him a blood debt. The meeting was brief, held in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. A guard lingered by the door, but he was one of the men Elias had helped, a simple fix on a grandfather clock that had been silent since the man's father died. The guard looked at the ceiling, deaf to the conversation.
The alloy in the eternal, Elias whispered, his voice a dry rasp like sandpaper on wood. It's not stable, Marcus. Julian thinks he has the Grail, but he has a fever dream. I need an anonymous whistle blown, not to the press, to the Geneva Oversight Committee. They won't listen to an anonymous tip against a man like Julian Vance, Marcus replied, his voice low and jagged. They will if it comes with a metallurgical scan request for the palladium-copper ratio. Elias leaned forward, his eyes burning like dying embers. And tell the board here that if my treatment doesn't include private correspondence privileges, I'll start talking to the federal investigators about the donations Dr. Eris has been rerouting to the offshore accounts. Elias wasn't just a watchmaker, he was a student of pressure. He knew that if you turned the crown just enough, the gears would bite. Julian wants the auction to be his coronation, Elias said, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. We're going to make sure the crown is made of lead.
The wheels were turning now, not with the grace of a timepiece, but with the heavy, crushing weight of a millstone. The silent grind had begun. The air in the Geneva auction hall was thick with the scent of lilies and cold, expensive perfume, the kind of smell that masks the rot underneath. On the giant monitors, the Patek Philippe Eternal sat under a halogen spotlight, its palladium copper case gleaming with a predatory luster. Julian Vance stood at the podium, his tuxedo tailored so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. He was basking in the hum of the elite, the wolves of Chicago and the vultures of Switzerland, all gathered to witness the sale of a soul he hadn't earned. Back in the sterile purgatory of the St. Jude wing, Elias Thorne watched the live stream on a grainy wall monitor. His hands, still trapped in those heavy plaster casts, felt like leaden anchors. But his mind was a scalpel. Now, Elias whispered to the empty room. 1,000 miles away, a hand went up in the third row. It wasn't a billionaire. It was a representative from the Institute of Chronometric Integrity, a shell company Marcus Sterling had birthed in a dark basement 48 hours prior.
The chair recognizes the gentleman, the auctioneer intoned, his voice smooth as polished marble. Before the opening bid of 50 million, the representative said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold wind through a graveyard. The Institute formally invokes Protocol 7. We require a resonance stability test on the housing. Given the proprietary alloy, the market needs to see the harmonic dampening in real time. A ripple of unease, sharp as a cracked gear, moved through the crowd. In the front row, the board of directors stiffened. Julian's smile didn't fail, but his eyes, those frantic, greedy eyes, flickered toward the wings of the stage. He knew the science, or rather, he knew the science he'd stolen. He didn't know the ghost in the machine. A standard request for a masterpiece, Julian said, his voice tightening. We have the sonic calibration unit backstage. Bring it out. Elias leaned back against his thin hospital pillow, a jagged, ghost-like grin stretching his face. He knew what happened when you subjected that specific palladium-copper ratio to high-frequency resonance. It wasn't an explosion. It was a surrender.
On screen, a technician placed a small vibrating sensor against the side of the watch. A low subterranean hum began to vibrate through the auction hall's sound system. Tick, tick, tick. As the frequency climbed, the Eternal began to sing. But it wasn't the pure note of a diamond. It was a discordant, metallic shriek, the sound of a heart failing. Inside the case, the microscopic instability Elias had planted years ago began to expand. The friction didn't just stop the time, it began to grind the gears into fine silver dust. The digital display tracking the beat error suddenly went red. The Eternal didn't just fail the test, it began to eat itself. Julian's face turned the color of a guttering candle. The room went silent, save for the mechanical death rattle of the $50 million lie. "The crown is lead, Julian," Elias rasped into the dark of his cell, "and the weight of it is going to bury you." The air in the Geneva auction hall, once pressurized with the silence of old money, ruptured like a dry lung.
On the massive digital displays, the Eternal didn't just stop, it hemorrhaged. The beat error readings didn't just climb, they flatlined into a jagged crimson streak. Through the macro lens camera, the world saw the unthinkable. The balance wheel, the very heart of the machine, stuttered and began to shed microscopic flakes of silver. It was a mechanical stroke, public and irreversible. Julian Vance stood frozen, his hand still outstretched as if to catch the falling stars of his reputation. The silence that followed was heavier than a tombstone. Then the first investor stood, a man whose wealth could buy small countries and whose temper could unmake them. "Fraud," the man spat, the word echoing like a gunshot. The panic was instantaneous. It wasn't the frantic scramble of a fire, it was the cold, calculated withdrawal of a tide. Julian's phone, resting on the mahogany podium, began to buzz, a frantic, rhythmic vibration that didn't stop. It was the sound of the board of directors cutting the cord. Back in the St. Jude wing, Elias watched the screen through a haze of triumph and shadows. The legal machine, once a blunt instrument used to bury him, was now a thresher. Marcus Sterling appeared on the news feed 10 minutes later, standing on the courthouse steps with a thick leather dossier. "The mental decline of Elias Thorne," Marcus told the swarming press, his voice as steady as a mountain, "was a fiction authored by Julian Vance to facilitate the largest intellectual property theft in horological history. A demented man does not program a metallurgical failure to trigger at a specific resonance frequency 3 years in advance. That isn't madness, it is a masterpiece of physics." The medical records that had chained Elias to his bed were being torn apart in real time. The expert doctors who had signed his commitment papers were already being subpoenaed for bribery. The incapacitated master was suddenly the most credible witness in the world.
Julian was escorted from the hall, not by his entourage, but by 3 men in dark suits with warrants that smelled of fresh ink and federal consequences. His face, once polished and arrogant, was now a mask of gray ash. Elias looked down at his heavy plaster casts. He didn't need to move his fingers to feel the gears of justice finally meshing. The hour of reckoning had struck, and for the first time in months, the world was ticking exactly as he had intended. The gravel of the driveway crunched under the tires of the black sedan like bone being ground in a mortar. Elias Thorne stepped out, the humid air of the Michigan shoreline clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. Behind him, the world of Geneva, the flashbulbs, the sterile courtrooms, and the hollow clinking of champagne flutes felt like a fever dream that had finally broken. He didn't look back at the driver. He didn't need to. The legal gag orders were signed. Julian Vance was trading his tailored silk for a state-issued jumpsuit, and the board of directors had dissolved into a panicked slurry of litigation.
Elias pushed open the heavy oak doors of his workshop. It smelled of linseed oil, old dust, and the cold, honest scent of brass. No bleach, no ozone, just the silence of a tomb waiting for a resurrection. He sat at his workbench, the scarred wood welcoming him home. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound case. Inside lay the true eternal, the twin movement he had built in the dead of night, the one without the copper palladium poison. With steady fingers, fingers that no longer trembled, fingers that had outlasted the vultures, he strapped the escapement to his left wrist. The escapement began its rhythmic dance, a heartbeat of perfect frequency. It wasn't a ticking, it was a reckoning. Outside, the gray waters of the lake churned against the rocks. Inside, the master was home. The shadows lengthened, the gears meshed, and for the first time in a lifetime, Elias Thorne owned every second of the coming night.